Hey, while I'm at the Y every day, now today it was Holly and Gabe, but when I'm at the Y in the morning, I'm listening religiously to SiriusXM and the Big 12 channel. And Ari Temkin joins us now. Ari, teams up with Dave Archer. They do a terrific show, and you get my Big 12 information. But they've been doing something pretty incredible. They've been recording a day in advance and doing their best to make it sound totally up to date, which in this day and time with things changing so rapidly is hard to do, but they've done a tremendous job of it. And Ari joins us now. Good morning. How are you?
Doing well, Robert. It's funny you say that because I don't know how up to date the show is today. With Gabe and Holly with the news coming down late last night, about 8:30 Central last night about the Big 12 schedule. But I think even though the news took a little time to get there, I think everybody kind of figured that that's what was going to happen anyways.
Yeah. No, and like I said, you guys have gone to some extremes sometimes to make sure, re-recording some stuff, doing some stuff to make it updated. But again, I can't wait till you're live again because it's a
Yeah,
great show. And I'll be honest, for somebody like me who does a show, a little later in the morning, I can't tell you how many times I've listened to you and Dave and your guests and said, okay, I need to talk about that a bunch in my show, or I need to react to that, and so yeah, it's must listen homework for this guy.
I appreciate that very much, and I mean it that is such a huge compliment. Because you've been pretty consistent in saying that, and I appreciate that very much because we've discussed in the past. It's I live in Dallas, and so and another part of my job is the Dallas Cowboys radio network, and
Right.
it's you can only from afar you can only learn so much about a team. I figured that out years ago covering the San Antonio Spurs. When you're there and you're covering the team versus when you're not at games and you're not at practices, it's just different. And so, I had the luxury in Dallas to be able to do that with the Cowboys, but obviously the Big 12 footprint spreads so far and wide that, we rely on you guys, in everywhere to kind of keep us in the loop of what's happening locally because we're not able to cover the teams the same way that we should be, to really cover them adequately. The great work that you do, Robert, and a lot of folks like you in Lawrence and in Norman and in Morgantown and in Ames and everywhere that helps us stay in the loop on what's going on inside locker rooms at the practice facilities. And it's one of the things I learned in covering sports is there's so much there that you can learn about a team that has nothing to do with sports. And I think it's such an important dynamic. Like we pay so much attention to the X's and O's and what happens in the field, but so much of what happens on the field is dictated by things that have nothing to do with the sport itself. And I think people don't truly grasp that, but you get to see that a lot when you cover a team. The relationships, the I always go back to the book of basketball written by Bill Simmons years ago, and basically the entire premise of the book is a quote he got from Isaiah Thomas, which is the secret to basketball from Isaiah Thomas has nothing to do with basketball. It's about everything else. It's about relationships. It's about the plane rides. It's about dinners. It's about hotels and the camaraderie and the love, the hate that those teams have for each other and one another and the family-like atmosphere. That's what dictates winning and losing more than anything else.
Yeah, and you know what? We're going to get to it. This has been a monumental summer, even beyond the pandemic when it comes to Oklahoma State football. But let's hit the current events first. And like you said, this was kind of presumed. I knew going into the meeting last night with the board of directors, Oklahoma State and Oklahoma, the two Bedlam rivals, were both on the same side of this. Both schools wanted to try and go with a 12 game schedule. I knew Oklahoma had mentioned that. Joe Castiglione had said, there's no guarantee we can get it, but if we can try, let's try for 12 games. And I know that Mike Gundy and Mike Holder and had convinced Burns Hargis that was what they wanted to do in Stillwater. And I know that Texas was more on the 9-1, and I think there were a lot of others that were on the 9-1 bandwagon as well. And when you saw what all the other Power Five leagues did, the Big 12 would have been sticking their neck out pretty good if they said, "Well, you guys do what you want, but we're going to play 12 games, okay?" I think reality kind of hit in that meeting last night. But your thoughts, because the non-conference games are going to go wide ranging right now. If you look at it, West Virginia, because they lost the game with Florida State, there was one of those preseason kickoff games, and then they lost their other non-conference game, which was with Maryland. Their lone non-conference game left is Eastern Kentucky, and that's not going to raise the meter a whole lot. Oklahoma State's got a decent game with Tulsa. I guess Oklahoma's going to follow through with Missouri State. It's the only game they have on the slate right now because I guess they're not going to try to go to New York and play Army. So these non-conference games are going to be really kind of tune-ups, don't you think?
Yeah, and I think it's very short-sighted in some ways by the Big 12. I mean, let's be honest here. This is all about money, and what I mean by that, beyond the obvious, is, and that's the reason they wanted 12 games, right? I mean, they want 12 games because they're trying to minimize the amount of revenue hit that it's going to take. It's the reason they probably didn't even get close to even entertaining the idea of having BYU join as a 11th member this year, a la Notre Dame in the ACC. It's another mouth to feed, so to speak. It's another piece of the pie that has to be divvied up. And so, I think a short-sighted move. I think if we look big picture at this thing, and let's just say that 10 games are played in college football, across the Power Five, and then they gear up for the college football playoff. There's no way that the Big 12 gets in because of that non-conference game that's basically going to be an FCS or a Group of 5 team. So, I mean, it just, to me, is short-sighted from a standpoint of, if you entertain the idea of potentially bringing in BYU, maybe it's another mouth to feed in terms of the revenue you have, but you're also raising the profile of each of your games because BYU is a legitimate Power 5 member, and you're probably also in a situation where you're going to get extra money if you get to the college football playoff, and BYU would be enough to raise the profile. I mean, you just compare 10 games for the SEC or 10 games out of the Big 10 compared to 9 Big 12 games and then one basically preseason game, one FCS team, there's just no way based on that the Big 12 gets a bid unless you've got an undefeated Oklahoma, an undefeated Texas, an undefeated Oklahoma State. And even in that situation, Robert, we've seen that before, right? Like where undefeated Oklahoma, undefeated Texas is not going to be the same as undefeated Oklahoma State, especially given that one non-conference game. That's just going to be so much ammo for the committee to go against the Big 12. So, I think it's short-sighted. I think not even entertaining the idea, which doesn't seem like they did at all, of BYU was short-sighted. And, look, I hope ultimately we can even have these arguments because who knows if we're going to have college football and who knows if we're going to have a college football playoff in 2020.
Yeah, and you and I are kind of on that bandwagon. I had floated that, and I had written a story about how much BYU could add. And here's the other thing, too. BYU does have their own TV contract with ESPN, and
right.
If they came in, they would bring that contract with them. Now, I talked to an administrator that says, Robert, even their contract, if it's just weighed out as a percentage of what they would get in our league, it's not nearly what we have. What a 1/11th of our contract would be is not what not what BYU would bring in. But you're right. I mean, you bring in, if you play 10 games and it's all the teams in your league and BYU as a provisional member, that's a much better schedule than, let's say, what we said about West Virginia playing Eastern Kentucky,
right,
or Oklahoma
right.
playing Missouri State. Those games, the committee's not even going to they're not even going to glance at those.
Right.
So you better be really, really good in your 9 games in your league if you're going to get their attention. I agree with you totally.
But look, I also at the same time get it. They're trying to withstand the loss of revenue here. I mean, they're going to lose revenue, just based on the fact that they've lost a couple of games. So they know that they're just trying not to lose any more revenue. So we shall see. This is going to. I mean, this is going to be just a crazy roller coaster season. It's only just beginning, and who knows what's going to transpire over the next few months. But it's obvious based on what we've seen from baseball already that without sort of a bubble, so to speak, like the NBA has. It's just going to be very, very difficult to, keep this thing contained. And, kind of as we talked about throughout, this is not just a battle on the gridiron. This is not just a battle of schemes and players and talent. This is a battle of protocol and procedures, and medical departments. So it's just going to be very interesting to even try to get those 10 games in for all of these Power 5 schools.
Now, over the course of the summer, like I said, I listen either in the car, truck when I'm driving, if I'm driving to Stillwater, or I'll listen in the morning at the Y and listen to Ari and Dave. And you guys have been a little, I don't want to say kinder, a little more less opinion and more just, here's what we know is going on in Stillwater, because there's so much that's gone on with with Chuba Hubbard on Twitter, his angst with Mike Gundy over the shirt, which really wasn't as much over the shirt as it was.
Right.
They wanted, the players wanted Mike Gundy to be more involved with them, and he has. He's met multiple times with every player individually, and they've had a lot of team meetings, and I think Mike gets it. But even yesterday was a huge news day. I mean, early in the day, Oklahoma State cancels homecoming, and for that to happen here, I mean, this was going to be the 100th homecoming, and
wow,
it's a huge deal. It's I know a lot of schools, like in the SEC, homecoming just means bring in a non-conference team you can floor, and we'll have a couple of parties and that's it. But at Oklahoma State, they do it up big, so canceling homecoming was huge. And then it came out publicly last night. I knew Sunday that Mike's mom, Judy Gundy, had passed away, and you talk about a football mom and somebody that was definitely the matriarch of the family. So just yesterday alone was a huge news day at Oklahoma State, and you guys have Oklahoma State's been supplying stories for you guys all summer long.
Yeah, I mean, just to kind of circle back to the homecoming thing. I mean, you also have the I'm sure they will do a lot this year, with T. Boone Pickens' passing, and his impact on that football program, and then on top of that, the expectations for the Cowboys this year. So you're right. Now, it's interesting you mentioned that, because there was also some news yesterday out of Fort Worth with TCU that was eerily similar, awfully similar to what we saw transpire, a month or 2 months ago in Stillwater. And I mean, I don't know. It's just a very interesting time in college sports, and what we see, what's going on with the Pac-12, and they're trying to sort of collectively bargain rights for themselves. Much of this started with Chuba Hubbard sort of voicing his displeasure, and then even more, basically showing his power, forcing there to be some change from Mike Gundy. When it came down, again, this has now impacted 3 schools, the Big 12 now, basically in the same vein, with Mike Gundy in Oklahoma State. Then you had the situation with Vic Koenig, the former defensive coordinator at West Virginia, and now with Gary Patterson at TCU, where you have these allegations of racism or perhaps racist remarks. And in the case, it's interesting because the Vic Koenig situation, to me, it was, it's like you wonder, could this kid have spoken to Vic Koenig privately and said something about this? Or would it have had the same impact? And I would argue with Chuba, he had to be public with it. And I know in the immediate aftermath of it, it was like, well, why didn't he just go to Mike Gundy and say something? Because it wouldn't have had the same impact. He goes to Mike Gundy and says something. Gundy might, say something to satiate Chuba at the time, but it doesn't force the change that Mike Gundy has sort of now been forced to undergo because of the fact that he made him public. But then you had these other situations with Gary Patterson, with Vic Koenig, where it's like, man, you wonder if this is better served not going public. So it's just interesting, the sort of similarities and differences in these situations. But obviously, we're talking about a completely different era of college sports, and it's changed so quickly. It's just incredible how quickly this has changed, and the power shift, the power dynamic shift, the players. I don't know that it's fully shifted to them, But I mean, you go from basically 100% of the power being on college football coaches, and I'm not just talking about in those locker rooms, but in those states, to where now the players have a certain amount of power, and they're choosing to exercise. It's a new day for sure.
Well, and here's something else to think about, Ari, because I was talking to Dave Hunziker, who's our play-by-play voice. We were talking this morning, and we've been looking at Major League Baseball. Okay, well, 60 game schedule. You got a confined time to play those, and the Miami Marlins have already lost 10 games. Now,
right.
Whether they make those up or whatever, it's going to be crunched up in double headers, and it's going to be uncomfortable, and it's not going to be easy to do.
Talking about now.
And Miami is probably out of it. Well, in college football this year, you have to depend on your players, not just to play well and prepare for games, but to do everything they can to keep themselves and their teammates safe away from the COVID-19, because you get a rash of COVID-19 and you just knocked yourself out of any opportunities in this football season. So there's two ways you can lose, and the players are really responsible, almost solely responsible for one of those ways, and that is obeying the protocols and staying safe. They have a lot of power.
No, you're right. And, when it came to the Dallas Cowboys, we kind of talked about when Zeke Elliott came down with COVID-19 a couple of months ago. My opinion on that was, when you've got athletes, in this case, $1 million athletes that I don't want to say that they don't think the rules apply to them, but more so that they're invincible, and they think they're invincible. And so they heard about this pandemic, and it's not that big of a deal. It won't affect me. And it's like, okay, if the idea here is, well, I'm not going to die from it, then, I mean, that shouldn't be the only indicator of whether or not you should care about trying not to get it. It's like, it's bizarre how that's become sort of the litmus test of, well, I won't die from it, so it's no big deal if I get it. It's like, that just dying shouldn't be the only metric or way you can define whether or not you want to get this thing. Now, so I think there probably are athletes that feel that way to a certain degree. It won't matter to me. I won't be affected by it. But I mean, I would hope in baseball, many of the teams are paying heed to what we've seen. Now, I just don't know that it has that same impact, the NFL or at the collegiate level. I hope it does. But it's not just about the outcome of the pandemic, the outcome of the virus on you. But to your point, like you're potentially derailing your entire season because you can't play games. You have to forfeit games. You can't, baseball can play doubleheaders. There's no doubleheaders in football. And there is a luxury here of playing once a week. And now you look at, 10 games over the course of, 15, 20 weeks, like that, there's an advantage there. I mean, if you try to sort of insert multiple bye weeks into the season, you get an extra week. That can help. But, it certainly comes to buy-in. It's about a coach, galvanizing locker room and not just telling them the importance of not going to parties, not going to bars, sort of putting yourself in a bubble. I mean, you can't just say that. There's other dynamics there because every coach is saying that. You really have to. It's on your leadership. It's on a whole bunch of factors that we'll see how successful it is.
Well, it's going to continue to be an interesting year because you'll love this. You might throw this at Brad Sham when you have a chance and you talk to him. My discussion with Dave Hunziker this morning is how we need to have a designated survivor on our broadcast crew, somebody that does their work solo. Yeah, so that if the crew were to get it, then the next week no one's available to do the game. Everybody's quarantined. So when you start talking about needing a designated survivor on a radio broadcast team, that's crazy. But hey, I appreciate you coming on and tell Dave hey, and you guys do a terrific job, and I will look forward to listening to you guys tomorrow morning.
Appreciate that very much, buddy. Yeah, we're going to record here in the next hour, so hopefully no news breaks. The last, I want to say...
You got plenty to talk about now.
The Sunday show we recorded, news broke on the SEC's decision and all that, so we basically had to re-record an entire show on Sunday. So I am so freaking ready to be back to live radio, my friend. I appreciate you,
Yeah.
and be well, okay?
All right. Take care, Ari.
Yep.
All right. Ari Temkin from, again, SiriusXM, the Big 12 channel. And